What if I told you that a small, rainy island in the North Atlantic once controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and ruled over 400 million people? What if I told you that this empire was so vast that the sun literally never set on it? And what if I told you that in just 50 years, it all came crashing down? This is the story of the British Empire, the largest empire in human history. A tale of ambition, greed, innovation, and exploitation that shaped the modern world in ways we're still grappling with today. From humble beginnings as a collection of feuding kingdoms to becoming the world's first global superpower, and then watching it all slip away. Grab your tea or coffee, I won't judge, because we're about to embark on a journey spanning 5 centuries, 6 continents, and countless lives. This is the entire history of the British Empire. Let's start at the beginning, but not where you might think. The year is 1066, and a bunch of French-speaking Normans have just conquered England. Wait, what? The British Empire started with the French conquering Britain? Here's the thing about empires. They're like snowballs rolling down a mountain. They start small, pick up momentum, and before you know it, they're an unstoppable force. The Norman conquest was that first push that got Britain rolling. You see, before 1066, England was just another medieval kingdom, more concerned with Viking raids than world domination. But the Normans brought something new: administrative efficiency and a hunger for expansion. They were like that friend who's really good at organizing group projects, except their project was conquering the world. Fast forward to the late 15th century. While Spain and Portugal were busy dividing up the New World like it was a pizza, England was still figuring out how to stop fighting itself. The Wars of the Roses had just ended, leaving the country exhausted but unified under the Tudors. Enter Henry VII, and more importantly, his son, Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII is famous for his 6 wives and his break with Rome, but here's what's really important for our story. He created the Royal Navy. Not intentionally as a tool of empire, mind you. He just wanted bigger, badder ships to intimidate the French. It's like buying a sports car to impress your neighbors and accidentally becoming a Formula One driver. But the real game changer came with his daughter, Elizabeth I. Picture this. It's 1588, and the most powerful naval force in the world, the Spanish Armada, is sailing toward England with 130 ships. It should have been game over for Little England. Instead, through a combination of superior tactics, better ships, and honestly, really good luck with the weather, the English sent the Spanish packing. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological one. Suddenly, England realized they could take on the big boys. It was like David beating Goliath, except David then looked around and thought, hey, I wonder who else I can take on. The defeat of the Spanish Armada didn't just protect England, it opened up the seas. With Spain weakened, other European powers started looking across the oceans with hungry eyes. But England had an advantage. They were an island nation. While continental European powers had to worry about land borders and armies marching across their territories, England could focus all their energy on their navy. Think of it like this. Imagine you're playing a video game where everyone else is stuck in ground combat, but you've unlocked the ability to fly. That's essentially what happened to England after 1588. Now, let's talk about how you actually build an empire. Spoiler alert, it's not like the movies. There's no dramatic flag-planting moment where someone declares, "We're building an empire now." Instead, it starts with merchants, adventurers, and a whole lot of accidents. The English approach to empire building was fundamentally different from the Spanish model. Spain sent conquistadors with armies to conquer and extract gold. England sent traders with ledgers to buy and sell. It's the difference between a smash-and-grab robbery and a long-term investment strategy. The East India Company, founded in 1600, perfectly embodies this approach. This wasn't a government organization, it was a private company with shareholders and quarterly reports. Imagine if Amazon decided to start its own country, complete with its own army and navy. That's basically what the East India Company became. Their initial goal was simple: compete with the Dutch for the lucrative spice trade in Asia. Europeans couldn't get enough of spices back then. We're talking about a time when pepper was literally worth its weight in silver. These spices didn't just make food taste better, they preserved it, which was crucial in an age before refrigeration. But here's where things get interesting. The East India Company didn't just want to trade, they wanted to control the trade. So they started establishing trading posts along the Indian coast. These weren't just warehouses, they were fortified settlements with their own soldiers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different kind of empire was taking shape. The first permanent English settlement in North America was Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607. And let me tell you, it was not a success story at first. Out of the 104 original settlers, only 38 survived the first winter. These weren't hardened warriors or experienced colonists. Many were gentlemen who had never done manual labor in their lives. The early American colonies were like a startup that almost went bankrupt multiple times before finally figuring out their business model. That business model, unfortunately, included the transatlantic slave trade. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The British Empire wasn't built on tea and politeness. It was built on the labor of enslaved Africans and the exploitation of indigenous peoples. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of Virginia, the cotton plantations of the American South, all of these generated enormous wealth that flowed back to Britain, but at a human cost that's impossible to calculate. By 1700, Britain had established a triangular trade system that was as efficient as it was horrific. Ships would leave British ports carrying manufactured goods to West Africa, where they would trade these goods for enslaved people. These people were then transported to the Americas under conditions so brutal that many didn't survive the journey. The ships would then return to Britain loaded with sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This wasn't just trade, it was the engine that powered Britain's rise to global dominance. Let's jump ahead to the 18th century, where things really start to heat up. By now, Britain wasn't just trading with the world, they were fighting for it. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was essentially World War II. It was fought on multiple continents simultaneously, with Britain and France as the main antagonists. In North America, it was called the French and Indian War. In India, it was a series of battles between the British and French East India Companies, each backed by local rulers. Robert Clive, a clerk-turned-military genius, became the face of British expansion in India. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive's forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal, despite being outnumbered 18 to 1. How? Through a combination of superior tactics, bribery, and sheer audacity. It's like winning a poker game with a pair of twos by convincing everyone else you have a royal flush. This victory gave the East India Company control over Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world. The wealth that flowed from Bengal to London helped finance Britain's wars against France and fund the Industrial Revolution. Some historians estimate that Britain extracted $45 trillion from India over 200 years. To put that in perspective, that's about 17 times Britain's current GDP. But let's not forget North America. The 7 Years' War ended with Britain controlling most of North America east of the Mississippi River. Quebec, formerly New France, was now British. The 13 American colonies were secure from French threat. Everything seemed perfect for the British Empire. Then came the part that every British school child learns about with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. How do you lose to your own colonies? The American Revolution wasn't just about tea taxes, though that's certainly part of the story. It was about two fundamentally different ideas of what the British Empire should be. The British government saw the colonies as sources of raw materials and markets for British goods to be governed from London. The colonists increasingly saw themselves as British citizens who deserved the same rights as people living in Britain. When Britain started imposing taxes without giving the colonists representation in Parliament, it created a constitutional crisis. The colonists weren't necessarily opposed to being part of the British Empire. They were opposed to being treated as second-class citizens within that empire. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about tea prices. It was a protest against the principle of taxation without representation. When a group of colonists dressed as Native Americans and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor, they weren't just making a statement about tea, they were making a statement about democracy. The American Revolution was a disaster for Britain, but like many disasters, it taught valuable lessons. Britain learned that ruling distant territories through force alone wasn't sustainable. They needed a new model, one that would allow more local autonomy while maintaining imperial unity. This lesson would shape how Britain approached the rest of their empire for the next century. While Britain was figuring out how to manage its empire, something revolutionary was happening at home: the Industrial Revolution. And I mean that literally. This was as much of a revolution as any political uprising. Picture Britain in 1750, a primarily agricultural society where most people lived in small villages and made things by hand. Now picture Britain in 1850, an industrial powerhouse where steam-powered machines could produce goods faster and cheaper than anyone had ever imagined possible. The timing wasn't coincidental. The wealth flowing in from the colonies provided the capital needed to invest in new technologies. The raw materials from the empire, cotton from America, jute from India, wool from Australia, fed the new factories. And the captive markets in the colonies provided guaranteed customers for British manufactured goods. It was like having a massive global monopoly board where Britain owned all the properties and everyone else had to pay rent. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in 1769 didn't just make factories more efficient, they made the British Empire more connected. Steamships could travel faster and more reliably than sailing ships. Steam trains could move goods from ports to inland cities faster than ever before. But here's the kicker. Britain tried to keep these technologies secret. They banned the export of machinery and even prohibited skilled workers from leaving the country. It's like if Apple tried to prevent anyone else from making smartphones. It worked for a while, but ultimately you can't keep technology locked up forever. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain from a small island nation into the workshop of the world. By 1850, Britain was producing half of the world's iron and coal and 2/3 of its cotton textiles. British factories were so efficient that they could produce goods, ship them halfway around the world, and still sell them cheaper than local producers. This industrial dominance gave Britain enormous leverage in international relations. When the Chinese government tried to stop British merchants from selling opium in China, Britain didn't send diplomats, they sent gunboats. The Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 are a perfect example of how the British Empire operated at its peak. British merchants were making enormous profits selling opium grown in British-controlled India to Chinese consumers. When the Chinese government, understandably concerned about the social damage caused by widespread opium addiction, tried to stop this trade, Britain went to war. The Chinese had numbers, but the British had modern weapons and steam-powered ships. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the knife was a traditional Chinese junk boat, and the gun was a steam-powered warship with modern cannons. The result was the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which forced China to pay massive reparations, cede Hong Kong to Britain, and open several ports to British trade. This wasn't just a military victory. It was a statement that the British Empire was now powerful enough to force any country, even as large as China, to bend to its will. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire had developed a unique character. Unlike previous empires that relied primarily on military conquest, the British Empire was built on a foundation of trade, industrial superiority, and naval dominance. They didn't need to occupy every territory directly. They just needed to control the trade routes and maintain naval supremacy. This was the era of gunboat diplomacy, the practice of using the threat of military force to secure favorable trade agreements. British warships patrolled the world's oceans, ensuring that trade flowed freely and profitably to Britain. By the 1870s, someone came up with a phrase that perfectly captured the scope of British power. The sun never sets on the British Empire. This wasn't just poetic language, it was literally true. With territories spanning from Canada in the west to Australia in the east, and from India in the south to Scotland in the north, there was always some part of the British Empire where it was daytime. But maintaining an empire this size required more than just military might and economic leverage. It required a whole new approach to governance, communication, and cultural integration. Enter the concept of civilizing mission. The Victorians convinced themselves that they weren't just conquering the world for profit, they were spreading civilization, Christianity, and the benefits of British culture to less fortunate peoples. It's a classic example of believing your own propaganda. This ideology justified everything from building railways in India to establishing schools in Africa. And to be fair, some of these projects did bring genuine benefits. The Indian railway system, built by the British, connected a vast and diverse subcontinent for the first time. Telegraph lines allowed nearly instantaneous communication across thousands of miles. But let's not romanticize it. These projects were designed primarily to benefit Britain, not the local populations. Railways were built to transport raw materials to ports, not to connect Indian cities to each other. Telegraph lines carried orders from London, not local communications. The civilizing mission also had a dark side, cultural suppression. British administrators often banned local languages, customs, and religious practices. In residential schools in Canada and Australia, Indigenous children were forcibly separated from their families and forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their cultural traditions. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the empire was becoming central to British identity. Children learned geography by studying the pink territories on world maps that represented British possessions. Popular literature celebrated the adventures of British explorers, soldiers, and administrators in exotic locations. The British Museum, established in 1753, became a symbol of this imperial mentality. Artifacts from around the world, the Elgin marbles from Greece, the Rosetta Stone from Egypt, countless treasures from India and Africa were brought to London and displayed as evidence of British global reach and cultural superiority. This period also saw the rise of what historians call the Great Game, the strategic rivalry between the British and Russian empires in Central Asia. Both empires were expanding, and Afghanistan became the buffer zone where their ambitions collided. The First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842, was a disaster for Britain. British forces occupied Kabul but faced constant resistance. When they finally retreated, only one British soldier made it back to India alive. It was a humbling reminder that military technology couldn't overcome determined local resistance in difficult terrain. But Britain learned from this failure. Instead of trying to occupy Afghanistan directly, they focused on maintaining friendly governments and preventing Russian influence. It was an early example of what we'd now call spheres of influence, rather than direct colonial control. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, known at the time as the Indian Mutiny, was another wake-up call. Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army rebelled, citing grievances ranging from religious insensitivity to unfair treatment. The rebellion spread quickly, and for a time, it looked like British control over India might collapse entirely. The British response was swift and brutal. They crushed the rebellion and used it as justification for even tighter control over India. The East India Company was dissolved, and India was placed under direct British government control. The last Mughal emperor was exiled, ending a dynasty that had ruled parts of India for over 300 years. The late 19th century was the British Empire's golden age. This was when the empire reached its maximum extent, when British power seemed unchallengeable, and when the benefits of empire were most visible to people living in Britain. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 revolutionized global trade. Suddenly, the journey from Britain to India was cut from months to weeks. Britain quickly moved to control this vital waterway, purchasing a controlling stake in the Suez Canal Company and later occupying Egypt to protect their interests. The Suez Canal is a perfect example of how the British Empire adapted to changing circumstances. They didn't build the canal. That was a French project. But when it became strategically important, they found a way to control it. It's like being the person who doesn't organize the party, but ends up controlling the music playlist. This period also saw the scramble for Africa, where European powers divided up the African continent among themselves. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was essentially a meeting where European diplomats drew lines on maps, often with little regard for existing ethnic, linguistic, or political boundaries. Britain emerged from this scramble with some of the most valuable territories in Africa. Egypt gave them control of the Suez Canal. South Africa had gold and diamonds. Nigeria had palm oil. Kenya and Tanzania provided strategic positions along the coast and inland routes. The discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa turned what had been a relatively minor possession into one of the empire's most valuable assets. But it also led to conflict with the Dutch-descended Boers, who had been living in the region for generations. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, was supposed to be a quick victory for the British Empire. Instead, it turned into a brutal 3-year conflict that cost Britain enormous amounts of money and international prestige. The Boers used guerrilla tactics that the British Army trained for conventional warfare was ill-equipped to handle. The British response included some of the darkest chapters in imperial history, the establishment of concentration camps where Boer civilians, including women and children, were imprisoned in terrible conditions. Over 25,000 people died in these camps, most of them children. The Boer War was a preview of the challenges that would ultimately bring down the British Empire. Local populations with strong national identities, fighting for their homeland, could resist even the world's most powerful military force. And the methods required to suppress such resistance were increasingly unacceptable to both international opinion and British public opinion. But at the time, these warning signs were overshadowed by the empire's apparent strength. The Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897 was celebrated as a festival of imperial power. Representatives from every corner of the empire came to London to pay homage to the Queen Empress who ruled over a quarter of the world's population. The ceremony was designed to showcase the diversity and unity of the empire. Indian princes rode alongside Canadian mounted police. Australian soldiers marched with troops from the Caribbean. It was meant to demonstrate that the British Empire was not just a collection of conquered territories, but a family of nations united under the British crown. Of course, this family metaphor glossed over the fundamental inequality of the relationship. Britain was clearly the patriarch making all the important decisions, while the colonies were expected to be grateful children who contributed resources and accepted guidance. The 20th century began with the British Empire at its peak, but it also brought the first serious challenges to British global dominance. Other industrial powers, Germany, the United States, and Japan, were catching up technologically and economically. World War I was supposed to demonstrate British strength. Instead, it revealed British vulnerability. The war cost Britain enormous amounts of money, resources, and human lives. By 1918, Britain was heavily in debt to the United States, marking the beginning of the transfer of global financial power from London to New York. The war also changed how people thought about empire. Millions of soldiers from the colonies fought for Britain: Indians, Australians, Canadians, South Africans, and others. They returned home with new ideas about equality, democracy, and self-determination. If they were good enough to die for the empire, they reasoned, shouldn't they have a say in how they were governed? The Russian Revolution of 1917 added another complicating factor. Suddenly, there was an alternative to the capitalist imperial model that Britain represented. Communist ideas about equality and anti-imperialism began to spread throughout the British Empire, particularly among educated colonial elites. In India, Mahatma Gandhi emerged as a leader of the independence movement. His approach was revolutionary not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. Instead of violent resistance, Gandhi advocated for non-violent civil disobedience. Instead of trying to defeat the British militarily, he aimed to make British rule morally indefensible. The Salt March of 1930 perfectly exemplified Gandhi's strategy. British law gave the colonial government a monopoly on salt production and imposed a tax on salt purchases. Gandhi walked 240 miles to the sea, where he symbolically made salt by evaporating seawater. It was a simple act, but it demonstrated that British law was both unjust and unenforceable if enough people chose to ignore it. Meanwhile, in other parts of the empire, different challenges were emerging. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 marked the beginning of a violent struggle for independence. The Irish War of Independence, 1919-21, ended with the partition of Ireland and the creation of the Irish Free State, though Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. The loss of most of Ireland was symbolically important. This wasn't some distant colony. This was part of the British Isles themselves. If the Irish could successfully resist British rule, what did that say about the permanence of the empire elsewhere? In the Middle East, World War I had led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and left Britain responsible for governing Palestine, Iraq, and other former Ottoman territories. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also promising to protect the rights of existing Arab populations. These contradictory promises would create decades of conflict. The interwar period saw Britain struggling to adapt to a changed world. The empire was becoming increasingly expensive to maintain, while its economic benefits were declining. Other countries were developing their own industries, reducing their dependence on British manufactured goods. The Great Depression of the 1930s further strained British financial resources. At the same time, new ideologies were challenging the imperial worldview. Fascism in Germany and Italy offered an alternative model of aggressive nationalism. Communism in the Soviet Union promoted international revolution against imperial powers. In the colonies, local nationalist movements were gaining strength and sophistication. World War II was the event that finally broke the British Empire's back, though it took several years for this to become apparent. Ironically, the war began with what seemed like vindication of British imperial strategy. When Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany in 1940, after the fall of France, it was the resources and manpower of the empire that kept the country fighting. Canadian pilots flew in the Battle of Britain. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa. Australian and New Zealand forces battled in the Mediterranean. The empire's finest hour came during the London Blitz, when the city endured months of German bombing but refused to surrender. Winston Churchill's speeches during this period created the mythology of British resilience that would outlast the empire itself. But the war also exposed fatal weaknesses in the imperial system. The fall of Singapore in 1942 was particularly devastating. This supposedly impregnable fortress, the key to Britain's position in Southeast Asia, surrendered to Japanese forces after less than a week of fighting. The myth of British military invincibility, already damaged by earlier defeats, was shattered completely. Even more significant was what happened in India. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people, while food was being exported from other parts of India to support the war effort. Churchill's response to requests for aid was to ask why Gandhi hadn't died yet. This callous attitude toward colonial suffering became increasingly difficult to defend. The war's end in 1945 found Britain victorious but exhausted. The country was heavily in debt, its cities were damaged by bombing, and its people were tired of sacrifice and hardship. At the same time, the war had accelerated the development of independence movements throughout the empire. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt in 1941, proclaimed the right of all peoples to self-determination. This was intended primarily as propaganda against Nazi Germany, but colonial leaders throughout the British Empire took it seriously. If the war was being fought for freedom and democracy, they asked, why shouldn't these principles apply to the colonies? The 1945 general election in Britain brought the Labour Party to power under Clement Attlee. Labour had always been more sympathetic to colonial independence than the Conservatives, and they faced a simple reality. Britain could no longer afford to maintain its empire by force. The decision to grant independence to India was both inevitable and revolutionary. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, its most populous and profitable colony. If India could become independent, the principle was established that any part of the empire could do the same. The partition of India in 1947 created 2 new nations, India and Pakistan. The process was rushed and poorly planned, leading to massive population movements and communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands of people. It was a tragic end to nearly 2 centuries of British rule in India. But from the British perspective, Indian independence also represented a new model for decolonization. Instead of fighting costly wars to maintain control, Britain could grant independence while maintaining friendly relations and economic ties with former colonies. The 1950s and 1960s saw the British Empire unravel with surprising speed. What had taken centuries to build was dismantled in just a few decades. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked the end of Britain's pretensions to superpower status. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded to retake control. But they had failed to secure American support. And when the United States refused to provide financial backing, both countries were forced to withdraw in humiliation. The message was clear. Britain could no longer act independently on the world stage. The age of gunboat diplomacy was over. From now on, any British military action would require American approval. This realization led to a fundamental shift in British policy toward the empire. Harold Macmillan, who became Prime Minister in 1957, gave his famous Wind of Change speech to the South African Parliament in 1960, acknowledging that the age of European colonialism was ending. But decolonization wasn't always peaceful. The Mau Mau Uprising in Kenya, 1952 to 1960, saw Britain fight a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against Kikuyu rebels. The British used tactics that included torture, collective punishment, and the establishment of detention camps where tens of thousands of suspected rebels were imprisoned. The Kenyan experience was repeated in other colonies where settlers had established significant communities. In Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, white settlers declared independence unilaterally in 1965, rather than accept majority rule. It took 15 years of international sanctions and civil war before Zimbabwe achieved legitimate independence in 1980. Cyprus saw a different kind of conflict, with Greek Cypriots seeking union with Greece in Knossos, while Turkish Cypriots feared for their safety. British attempts to maintain control led to a guerrilla war that ended with Cyprus becoming independent in 1960, though with British military bases remaining on the island. Throughout this period, Britain was developing what became known as the Commonwealth model of decolonization. Former colonies would become independent but remain members of the Commonwealth of Nations, maintaining cultural and economic ties with Britain while accepting the British monarchy as head of the Commonwealth. This was remarkably successful in many cases. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had been effectively independent for decades but maintained strong ties with Britain. Even newly independent countries like India chose to remain in the Commonwealth, seeing it as a useful forum for international cooperation. The Commonwealth model allowed Britain to retreat from empire with dignity while maintaining influence in its former colonies. It was a remarkable formula that transformed the British Empire into a voluntary association of independent nations. By 1970, most of the British Empire had achieved independence. Apart from a few small territories, Gibraltar, the Falklands, various Caribbean islands, the empire that had once ruled a quarter of the world's population was reduced to the United Kingdom itself. So, what was the ultimate legacy of the British Empire? This is one of the most contentious questions in modern history, and the answer depends largely on where you're asking it. From one perspective, the British Empire was a force for modernization and progress. The English language became the world's lingua franca, facilitating international communication and trade. British legal systems, based on common law and parliamentary democracy, were adopted by many former colonies and remain influential today. Infrastructure projects like railways, ports, and telegraph systems connected previously isolated regions and accelerated economic development. The empire also played a role in abolishing slavery, though this is complicated by the fact that Britain had been one of the world's largest slave traders for over a century. The Royal Navy's suppression of the Atlantic slave trade after 1807 saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but this came after Britain had already profited enormously from the slave trade. From another perspective, the British Empire was primarily an extractive enterprise that impoverished its colonies while enriching Britain. Economic historian Utsa Patnaik has calculated that Britain extracted $45 trillion from India alone over 2 centuries. This wealth helped fund Britain's Industrial Revolution and global dominance, while leaving India impoverished at independence. The empire also disrupted traditional societies and created artificial boundaries that continue to cause conflict today. Many of the world's current conflicts, from Kashmir to Palestine to Sudan, can be traced back to decisions made by British colonial administrators. Perhaps most significantly, the British Empire established patterns of global inequality that persist today. The division between developed and developing nations largely corresponds to the old division between imperial powers and colonies. Former colonies continue to export raw materials to former imperial powers and import manufactured goods, perpetuating economic dependency. But the empire's legacy is also visible in more positive ways. The global spread of English created a shared language for international commerce, science, and culture. British educational systems produced generations of leaders in former colonies who went on to build successful independent nations. Sports like cricket, rugby, and football became global phenomena, creating shared cultural experiences across different continents. The Commonwealth of Nations, the empire's institutional successor, remains an important forum for cooperation between developed and developing countries. While its political influence has declined, it continues to facilitate trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic cooperation between its 54 member nations. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the British Empire is the idea of globalization itself. The empire created the first truly global economic system, connecting all inhabited continents through trade networks, communication systems, and shared institutions. While the empire is gone, the interconnected world it created remains. Today, Britain is still grappling with its imperial past. The Brexit referendum of 2016 was partly driven by nostalgia for a time when Britain was a global power rather than a member of the European Union. Some politicians spoke of creating global Britain that would reclaim its place as a major international player. But this imperial nostalgia often ignores the costs of empire, both for Britain and for its former colonies. Maintaining the empire ultimately bankrupted Britain and left it as a middle power dependent on the United States. For the colonies, the legacy includes economic underdevelopment, ethnic conflicts, and artificial borders that continue to cause problems decades after independence.
The British Empire was the largest empire in human history. But like all empires, it was ultimately temporary. What made it remarkable wasn't just its size, but its transformation from a traditional empire based on military conquest to a modern system based on economic dominance and cultural influence. The empire rose because of a unique combination of circumstances: Britain's geographic position as an island nation, the early development of industrial technology, naval supremacy, and the wealth extracted from colonies that funded further expansion. It fell because these advantages eventually eroded, and because the idea of empire itself became incompatible with modern notions of democracy and human rights. The story of the British Empire is ultimately a human story. It's about the ambitions and achievements of explorers, traders, and administrators who believed they were building a better world. It's also about the suffering and resistance of millions of people who were conquered, enslaved, and exploited in the name of progress and civilization. Understanding this history helps us make sense of the modern world. Many of today's global challenges, from economic inequality to ethnic conflicts to climate change, have roots in the imperial period. But so do many of the institutions and ideas we use to address these challenges, from international law to global communications to the concept of universal human rights. The British Empire shaped the world we live in today. Whether that influence was ultimately positive or negative is a question each generation must answer for itself. But there's no doubt that the world would be very different if a small island in the North Atlantic had never decided to rule the waves. The sun has finally set on the British Empire, but its shadow, both dark and light, continues to shape our world today. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting epitaph for the empire that once claimed the sun would never set on its dominions.
Thanks for joining me on this journey through 5 centuries of history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the British Empire, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. What aspect of the British Empire would you like to see explored in more detail? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.